All right, go for it.
Second. Okay, so this will be a synopsis of chapter 6, The Age of Kant and Goethe. Two giant monumental figures, pretty long chapter. And so it's just going to be a breakdown just as it goes through the book for the most part, or through the chapter. First couple of pages are platitudes for Kant and Goethe. He uses this, Steiner uses this to also introduce, kind of like foreshadow, a few of the secondary figures that he'll have later on in the chapter. Those figures are, let me get their names right. Okay, Fichte, Schiller, and I think John Paul was the third one I meant to write down here. So that was the first couple of pages. And we have a few pages where it's kind of like a minor recap of some of the big guns from the last chapter or two, like Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Hume, and that's woven in with Goethe's and Kant's kind of like reception of that group, like what they did. I would say it's Goethe and Kant's what they thought of it and how they're responding to it, sort of. And overall, my gist of it was that this response can best be condensed down into the question, reason or belief. You've got to choose one. Which one are you going to go with? I was surprised to hear that Goethe held on to reason. I think for some reason I thought because he's so emblematic of the Romantic movement that he wouldn't have held on to reason, but it does seem like he held on to reason. For Kant, building off of Hume's work, he concludes that, and this is of course all my opinion, I might be wrong about all this and probably am, but he concludes that what is knowledge for the human mind does not come from the reality of the world. Human reason is prescriptive onto the world. It's not so much descriptive, it's prescriptive. That kind of puts it kind of makes it hard to say that there's any truth in the world, because it becomes very sort of vacuous, self-reflective, almost vacuous, and that's what really bugged him. He accepted Hume's kind of like criticism of causation and stuff like that, and what and what the conclusion was there, but he obviously doesn't want to live in a world where it's hard to know what is truth. So that was the first part of it. And I can try to describe Kant's position if you guys wanted me to, but I think we might just get into that as we go along. So, because it's kind of confusing anyway. Okay, and so in some of the other notes here, I noticed that Kant had a really good discussion on aesthetics right after that, and I found some of the tangential things that I learned about Kant, such as like his thoughts on aesthetics, his book General Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, where he kind of posited a very cogent theory about, at least very cogent to our contemporary understanding of science, about the constitution of the solar system, from gases to everything, and it seemed very cogent. So I found those little bits like that I hadn't heard about Kant to be extremely interesting. Okay, so then he moves on to Goethe, and when going over Goethe, he kind of presented Goethe as being almost like a response to Kant. And I'm not even sure if that's what Goethe wanted, but that's the way he's kind of being presented. They're kind of in a bit of a conversation here. And alongside Goethe, he also showed a few other critiques of Kant. He interweaves his exposition of Goethe with some of these other critiques from contemporary thinkers, contemporary to Kant and Goethe. Then he also compares a few other points from Goethe, between Goethe and Kant, a few other specific points. It seems like if I remember right, some of their thoughts on aesthetics, he compared them. Some of their thoughts on biology, with a point to the Erbpflanze, which is a funny word I just wanted to work in. Then he gets into the group that he kind of foreshadowed earlier on, Fichte, Schiller, and then John Paul. For Fichte, seems like according to Steiner, Fichte's position is, and to quote Steiner, because knowledge is a dream and the moral world order is the only true reality for Fichte, he places the life through which man participates in the moral world order higher than knowledge, the contemplation of things. And then to illustrate that, he quotes Fichte as saying, nothing has unconditional value and significance except life. Everything else, for instance, thinking, poetic imagination, and knowledge, has value insofar as it refers in some way to the living, insofar as it proceeds from it or means to turn back into it. And so that was his explanation of what I felt like kind of illustrated Fichte's position. I also found Fichte very interesting because he was kind of doing some like I am meditations that reminded me of kind of like Vedanta, Hindu Vedanta sort of thinking. And I found that very interesting. I found Fichte very interesting altogether, and also particularly because it seemed like Steiner's language and also his use of pull quotes was different for Fichte compared to a lot of other philosophers, writers that he's gone over. He struck me as having a certain enthusiasm for Fichte. He gave him huge pull quotes. His use of verbs were more enthusiastic, and so I don't know if anybody else saw that. It just seems like he likes Fichte quite a bit, and he might even have a certain identification of Fichte. So I don't know if anybody else saw that, but and I like Fichte a lot too. I didn't know much about Fichte, so I found that interesting. Then he moved on to Schiller. At this point, I was really starting to rush. I found Schiller's stuff looked really interesting, like beauty and playing and stuff like that. Don't know if I really was able to stick my teeth into it too much, but some of the things I did find interesting is that it seems like, according to Steiner, Schiller is the one that found a mediation between the world conceptions of Kant and Goethe. And for me, it almost seemed like Steiner was saying that Schiller had posited a similar theory to the development of the soul life from ancient times until now, kind of like, the theory that Steiner's working with. It seemed like he was saying that Schiller was talking about this too. And so I found that interesting because between the mediation that he says that happened that Schiller did between Goethe and Kant, that means the chapter alone pivots on Schiller, kind of like as a hub. But then also perhaps Schiller might be the hub that this whole theory revolves around in some ways. Even though he seems like he's somewhat small part of this book, he could be what it's all rotating around in some ways. But I don't have hardly any familiarity with Schiller at all, so I don't know if I could really speak to that. And then he moved into the final section, which, if I'm not mistaken, seemed like it was an addition that was added with one of the later editions. And there he talks about Jean Paul, who seemed terribly romantic, kind of religious. He talks about romantic irony, and he also tries to nutshell Romanticism and the Romantic movement, which is a difficult thing to do. And so, and my response to romantic irony is like, I don't know how much I like that very much. I don't know if it's very useful, but and that's how he ended the chapter. And that's all that I got, guys. Thanks for listening to me.
Yeah, not an easy chapter to summarize. Thanks, Matt. I think you saw a lot of us nodding when you were noting the enthusiasm that Steiner has for Fichte. So much of Fichte's championing of the ego as an act rather than a fact or a substance or something, as Descartes had it, perhaps, I think helps Steiner gain clarity and more clearly articulate the importance of the freedom of the ego as what's most important for our world epoch to realize. Though, as we'll see in the next chapter, Fichte and his ego needs to be balanced by Schelling and his appreciation for nature. As a Schellingian, I'm super excited about the next chapter, but I'll hold off on that for now. Anyone else have preliminary reflections they wanted to share?
I have just a little consideration about this very thing regarding Fichte's appreciation by Steiner. And I've noticed that in Freemasonry, Fichte is considered a very important thinker. And most of the times I heard great words about Fichte's philosophy nowadays. They came from people who were somehow attached to Freemasonry. And since I know that during 1906, 1907, Steiner became a member of the Memphis Mizraim part of Freemasonry, which of course was just one of many influences on him. But maybe he took this particular regard to Fichte, in regards to Fichte, from his studies inside Freemasonry. It might be possible. I don't know if anybody knows anything about this. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Angus.
Yeah, Fichte. I thought I'd start by reading a quote from the text and then come back to a couple of points and perhaps get back to Lorenzo's point there as well. So we're on page 231 in my document. It says, I'll read. Okay, Fichte wrote these words in the preface to the publication of lectures in which he had spoken to students of Vienna on the destination of the scholar. Views like those of Fichte have their origin in a great energy of the soul, giving sureness for knowledge of world and life. Fichte had blunt words for all those who did not feel the strength in themselves for such a sureness. And he goes on in that time. Another point that I think is relevant here is the Philosophy of Freedom was written in 1894, and the Philosophy of Freedom is a reconciliation of Fichte's ego, fixation, if perhaps not using the correct word, but sort of like it's like the security that's given in by the ego philosophy, idealism of extreme idealism. I think Steiner might even call it transcendental idealism, but I'm unsure. And balanced with that's what I'm not sure of. I know in the past I've read that Steiner talks about this meeting he had with some type of nobody knows who was told basically your job is to reconcile Fichte, and I'm just going to have to put question mark because I can't remember the name. I've just had an attempt to try and find it. Somebody else here might already know who that person is. But Fichte was of interest to Steiner long before Freemasonry. It's in my world, but it doesn't surprise me his interest in Freemasonry, because this freedom without a strong ego is impossible. It's like in the way I understand Steiner. So hence, Fichte is like one of the most, as an eloquent and vociferous proponent of individual freedom, is likely to be very music to Steiner's ears, I think. I think those are the two points that I wanted to make. Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised that. Oh, sorry, John. One sec. That Steiner didn't mention one of the funniest lines from Fichte. I think it's in the 1794 Wissenschaftslehre, where he says that it would be easier, to summarize, I put the quote in the chat, but it'd be easier to convince most men that they're really a piece of lava on the moon than it would be to direct their attention to their self, to the self in the sense that he means it. So it's this real experiential realization that mere logical proofs or arguments would never actually succeed in convincing anyone of. So there is something, I think, Matt, you were saying there's something of Vedantist spirit at work in Fichte, in the sense that there's a awakening that needs to occur. And he had various exercises in his lectures where he attempted to bring his students to this type of awareness. He would tell them in Zen fashion almost to stare at the wall and then to try to perceive themselves staring at the wall, and then ask who is now doing the perceiving. John, go ahead.
Thank you all. This is very stimulating discussion. I think, Angus, I may be wrong about this. A friend of mine sent me an article that identified that stranger, that spiritual stranger that Steiner mentions, and he calls him the M. He gives him I believe he gives him the M, that letter. And my friend has sent the article. I'll post it because it was really intriguing. But this article, they think they know who M was. And it was definitely part of the secret brotherhood, sisterhood. It wasn't for the public. It was definitely for those who had been initiated and credentialed, and there were curses. If you broke through, if you spoke out, there were penalties. Maybe not curses, but there were definitely penalties. There's some speculating, like Gary Lachman, who wrote a biography on Steiner, that the strange wasting away illness in the last 6 months of Steiner's life may have been brought on by a psychic attack, because he'd left himself so vulnerable to the psychic attacks by breaking a vow. Highly speculative, I do not know. But I do know that we need safe containers for these kinds of explorations, because clearly the thinkers that we're all studying here have a shared history of persecution for being on the wrong side. And, the 30 Years' War, Kant was extremely aware of all of this, and so was Schiller, and so was Goethe. And they thought they were all promoting a new age. So I just would also recommend, if you want some really good background, is Matt Segal's diagrams. I think you have a video of your diagrams of the major German philosophers. I think Fichte, Hegel, they're all there. And I think he does inspired by perhaps Steiner, a kind of a diagrammic imagination is at play there, which I highly recommend to all of you perceptual learners out there like myself, who has a very hard time with all of these words. But you show me a picture and I get it right away. So I just want to add something a little bit weird, but I think that Steiner is a spiritual researcher. He is very often speaking to other spiritual researchers about spiritual research. He's also talking to people who are not spiritual researchers. And he has great respect for those who are not spiritual researchers. He believes those who are not spiritual researchers, who don't travel in these spiritual worlds, can only benefit from hearing adequate descriptions of these spiritual worlds, even though they just decide they don't need to pursue it. So in that spirit, I'm going to share something that happened to me last night. I was asleep. My body was asleep, but my mind was awake, and I was watching hypnagogic images, okay? Which is sort of in between. It's an in-between zone. It's in between, usually between dreams, between coming up into waking consciousness and going back down deeper into the delta and perhaps the theta. So it's sort of in between. So I'm seeing these images and they look like this, except they're moving images. So it's right out of Kandinsky, okay? So I'm seeing all this swirling stuff. It's kind of fascinating, but I also, as I'm watching this stuff, I'm remembering I had a previous dream. And I'm afraid because if I go into memory of that previous dream, I'll disrupt this beautiful display. And in that conflict about, oh, well, I can stop this and go back into ordinary memory and try to retrieve some of this dream that just passed. But I just let the imagery continue. And I was able to remember the dream. But it wasn't by making pictures. It was by, and I don't know exactly how I did this. It had something to do with words that I got a few key words from that episode, that previous episode, and the whole thing came back into memory without disrupting what was happening. So I believe that this kind of spiritual research, which I'm conducting and sharing in this public space, is, I think, resonates with Fichte. Because Fichte said it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. I mean, he didn't say that, but that's me misquoting, quoting somebody else who was saying, I think, something very similar. It's that when he says the ego is he says a God could create me, but he would have to leave to myself to recognize myself as an I, the pronoun I. I give my ego consciousness to myself. This is a very big claim. And he says, but it doesn't matter if you don't act upon it. So what you know to be true, that your consciousness has given to you, you have to find a way of acting in the world. And I think this is very stimulating to me because if we can, when we have these eureka moments, they do not come to an unprepared mind. I think this is what Steiner was saying. You got to prepare for this or it'll blow your fuses. But if you get a eureka, it goes nowhere unless you can find an action that can amplify it. And when you amplify it in the world, get feedback, then you can step back and you can contemplate what you've learned by having this eureka and having taken this action to ground it. So he goes on to say, I'm quoting Fichte here, I believe I'm quoting Fichte. I am a confused picture of pictures. All reality is changed into a strange dream without a life of which to dream, without a spirit to do the dreaming. It changes into a dream which is held together by a dream of itself. This is the dream of that dream. So maybe I'll go on, maybe I'll do the volley thing and post the dream that I had, because I think it's a kind of meta dream. I also think it's a social dream. This isn't a dream necessarily about me. It's a dream I think about our activity together, creating a new kind of culture, which I think is what all of these thinkers were up to. So anyway, thank you for this opportunity to share my spiritual research, to take an action. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I look forward to that volley, John, to hear more about this dream. You've, I think we're all reiterating the way in which Fichte is a philosopher, but also trying to bring this sort of mystical feeling for the depths of the soul to bear on certain philosophical questions. Like, for example, you know, when he tries to show the genesis of the Kantian categories through acts of will, rather than just being sort of delivered from on high as they are in Kant. He's bringing mysticism of a sort and philosophy together, but he wasn't himself equipped, it seems, to translate his abstractions into a poetic form that could be widely received as the Romantics were. But I feel there's a lineage here that Fichte is in that goes back to some of the German mystics like Meister Eckhart, who would say, you know, the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. And there's another line from Eckhart I read recently that's, he says, "We are all meant to be mothers of God, for God is always needing to be born." And I think of the Fichtean ego as, in some sense, God being born within each of us through an act that only we can bring about, that God is, in this sense, powerless. Our freedom is contributing to the divine nature by birthing God within our souls in a way that God could not do without our participation, right? And this deep insight is core to so much of spiritual science. So obviously Steiner and Goethe, I think, carries this further, reconnecting the ego with nature. Why don't we let Stuart go next, and then Matt. Go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, I don't have. I just had a question about one aspect of what John said, which is I thought the dream built upon dreams, dreams of dreams, and so on. I thought that was not Fichte. Oh well, it is there. Okay. I had sort of read it in my PDF form where these things aren't clearly distinguished. But that actually was setting up that Steiner raised it because it sets up the criticism he does have of Fichte that occurs particularly in Truth and Knowledge, in the most detail that I'm aware of. That the problem with Fichte's, despite the truth of Fichte's assertion of the self as a kind of self-sustaining reality, Fichte failed to connect that up with the given reality that we don't create. And so the dream upon dreams, I thought, it turns out apparently it was, looking at the book I have, it does look like it was definitely a quote by Fichte, but it's a quote that sets up a certain criticism of Fichte as well. Because clearly Steiner doesn't think that our ultimate reality is just a dream amongst dreams. That was it.
Yeah, I agree. This PDF is a little confusing. I was confused exactly. When is it Steiner's voice? When is it a quotation, a direct quotation, or when is he summarizing several different voices? So that is very confusing for me as well.
I think it's because the block quote isn't obvious in the PDF. Anyway, yeah, I was also trying to figure out. I was like, okay, that was a block quote. Anyway.
I was just gonna come back to Angus talked about somebody where Steiner was tasked to place Fichte or reconcile Fichte with some other philosopher. I was wondering, would there have been a chance that would have been reconciling with Nietzsche by any chance? Because you couldn't remember the other philosopher. And there's a part in here where he's talking about Fichte, really sounds Nietzschean to me. And I just wondered if that might have been the philosopher, but I know that maybe an obvious.
To my mind, it's not. My thoughts are going in the direction of Goethe, Schiller, but I'm not sure. That's why I was wondering if somebody else actually knew.
Go ahead, Lorenzo.
Yeah, I wanted to open up a parallel between the difference that Steiner sees between Kant and Goethe and the discovery of the unconscious, because since the real difference to Steiner is where the subject ends, we could say, because in Goethe, the subject is nature itself, that is perceiving itself in man. This means that the subject, at least in some way, is not just the individual, but is the whole of the world. And there is a distinction between what we perceive as subject and what we perceive as object, that in Goethe comes later, is not essential. So I thought maybe we could think of Goethe as a precursor of the concept of the unconscious, but in the Jungian way, of a collective unconscious, that we just perceive ourselves as limited, but that barrier is actually something that can be walked through, and actually what is the subject is much more is much wider than that.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think Schelling was the first to use unbewusst, unconscious, to speak of the unconscious. But certainly Schelling and Goethe were close collaborators. I think Schelling
also Hegel has it, taking it from Jakob Böhme, I guess. Even if Jakob Böhme's word for it was just Ungrund, yeah, but there's a connection between the concepts.
For sure. Stuart, is your hand up again, or is that still up from? Oh, go ahead then, Angus.
Yeah, a couple of things. Connecting with Hegel and Schelling that you were talking about, and this the growth of awareness of the unconscious. My understanding is that it was at this time that the Bhagavad Gita was making its way into these people's hands, and it's like Eastern learnings, which obviously it's like I've known about this and remembered it for a long time. So that's part of the stimulation that comes in. But I don't personally, I don't see that directly connected with what I think the essence of it, of Goethean thinking is for Steiner. He talks about sort of like gegenständliches Denken. Steiner, when he's talking about in Knowledge of Higher Worlds, he talks about like imaginative consciousness. And the way I imagine this, or the way I see this, is what we do is and you can see this reasons why it might be like this in the exercises that you can do to awaken this type of consciousness. But what you're doing is you're You are literally placing images in your mind, but that have a truth content taken from this world. And so for example, you might sort of like use sort of like a living plant versus a dead plant, and sort of like following the processes, just as an example. But then something curious can happen, or something unexpected to somebody who's not aware of these processes, is that if this is pursued for a long time, then actually that thinking literally gains life. I mean, taking a rather macabre example, like Frankenstein being brought to life, it's these things, that these dead pictures that we've placed in our consciousness, they actually become alive. And first they start moving with their, it's like thought content, a little bit like the Greek way of, it's like linking thought and it's like images together. And this stage can also be taken even further. And I think the connection to this is with the end of this chapter, is that because he sees what Steiner, one of the things that Steiner is describing here is how Schiller is sort of like providing the bedrock on which a new type of Greek thinking, or a new improved Greek thinking 2.0, where thinking isn't in abstract concepts, it's full of a living process. So yeah.
Might I, sorry, Alex, can I answer Angus directly? I saw you raised your hand. I will go.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Angus, you're preceding me. You brought into the picture something I wanted to talk about the living idea.
Mm-hmm.
And the living idea is, to my understanding, is in itself structurally different from let's say the dead idea, or a constructed idea. And this difference could be treated with in semiotics. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Peirce's writing and diagrams and categories. Anyway, Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, created a semiotics to distinguish between images, let's say between signs, and there are three kinds of signs, and the kind of sign which the subject itself is, because is alive, is in itself a dialectical image, is an interpreter, an interpretant, interpreter, I guess is the right word. So I was, because this idea of the unconscious, I know it's something that Steiner isn't going to, is just thought I had, something, let's say, new. But I was asking myself, is it possible that every living idea, every interpreter, structurally must have some kind of unconscious that is at one time being itself, and at the same time being connected, being all the rest, being the whole of nature? And so I know I'm saying something that Steiner didn't say, and just putting some ideas. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Can I respond?
Excellent answer.
Oh, I'm sorry, Alex, did you want to go?
For me, it's fine if you want to wrap up this ideas around the unconscious. I wanted to pick up something from Angus, but I can do it in a few
No,
moments.
please do, Alex, and then I'll respond to Lorenzo if I may.
And then we'll hear from Josh.
Okay, then. Thanks. But yeah, I listening to you, Angus, about the living idea and the imaginative exercises. I was trying to sort of wrap up what, in my what Steiner means, and towards the end of the chapter, he writes that because soul consciousness has been transformed into self-consciousness in modern man, the question of world conception arises. How can self-consciousness experience itself so vividly that it feels its conscious process as permeating the creative process of the living world forces? And then just in the next paragraph, in Goethe, Fichte, and Schiller, the experienced ID forces its way into the soul. Such a process had previously happened in the world of the Greeks with the perceived ID. These concepts are not familiar to me. I don't know if they are Steiner's concepts or if they are philosophical concepts that are common in his time. But I was thinking that most of this chapter and a bit in the previous chapter, we are one theme is this of truth and certainty of knowledge. And my experience in studying a little bit of Goethean science and doing these type of exercises is that the truth that is arrived at of a phenomena is difficult to share. Share in the sense of the sciences or the knowledge that we are more certain in. So let's say, mathematics, geometry, using words, concepts, that we can share with each other. And that brings a ground of certainty between us. An imagination is a bit more difficult to share, but it brings us, at least in my experience, it brings a different way of certainty and connection with the world that the normal hard science haven't brought for me. And it's different from the sort of inner experience of feelings, emotions that are also difficult to share with other people. So I can't experience what another person is feeling in a sense, in a moment. And just bringing on these concepts that Steiner has here, I was wondering if the way the Greeks were perceiving ideas is the way that these imaginations will become perceptions for us and the current mode of consciousness that we're living in. If that was clear what I meant by that.
After Josh has said his bit, I'll try to give an example of what I'm what might be a possible answer to what you're saying. Okay.
Why don't you go ahead, Josh? And then
maybe there was somebody else that wanted to respond.
I know John had something. I don't know if it. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Okay.
Josh.
All right. Maybe sort of like with Alex. I was trying to think of, like, going back to the title of the book. What is the riddle that philosophy has caused? For us to have to deal with, which I think is one of the things that Steiner's trying to bring out, as opposed to just like giving a history of philosophy. It's like, what problems has philosophy created for us, and why are they such big problems? And so I've also been having to delve into Kant way more deeply than maybe I would like to, or is easy for another class. So I was actually trying to go through and understand the transcendental deductions, the subjective and the objective transcendental deductions. And so it seems like what the overall riddle is you know, inspired by Hume, you know, Kant has not only set up the idea that we can't have contact or direct knowledge of things in themselves or the noumena, but also, as everybody's touching on too, our own inner self, which is what I think I've come to the conclusion of what the subjective transcendental deduction is about when he finally comes to the idea of the transcendental ego. And I kind of thought of this like, you know, say if I'm listening to my own thoughts, like I'm just walking down the street, I'm like, oh, there's a pretty tree over there. It has some green leaves, and I'm thinking all these things. And then I think like, oh, it's cold. Let me put on my jacket. You know, the transcendental ego is not actually those thoughts. Like that chatter going on in my brain is not my actual self. My actual self, or the transcendental ego, is the one listening to all that, if that makes sense. And I don't know if that's what Kant was onto, but that's kind of what it made me think of. So like the riddle is really like twofold. You know, it's not only do we not have, well, so he says anyway, I don't think it's right. I would push back on it, you know, tooth and nail, but that not only do we not have contact, direct knowledge of the noumena of the sort of external world, but also our very like egoic self is also a form of noumena for Kant too, which is a pretty bad state to be in, I think. But it's also pretty liberating too, because I feel like Goethe starts to help to resolve this in sort of sowing the seeds of the idea that it is nature or the noumena itself which has given us all these faculties in the first place. And so we can be justified and trust that knowledge. Granted, we might not see the atoms in the leaf, you know, and the electrons and subatomic particles whizzing around, but nonetheless, something that's in that leaf impinges upon us in this sort of direct connective way that overcomes Kant's, you know, dire strait, so to speak. So I just want to throw that out there as like, what is the main riddle here that's so powerful? Why is it so powerful? So I don't know if that stimulates anything. You know, maybe somebody'd like to say, I don't know if your view of the subjective transcendental deduction is right or not, but that's what I'm coming up with anyway.
Yeah, that's very insightful, Josh. I think you're right. It would be bad enough if Kant just cut us off from things in themselves out there, but he also, you know, in referring to time as an inner sense, cuts us off from being able to access the ego, which also becomes a kind of noumenon. You know, he enters into dialogue with Descartes in the Critique of Pure Reason, and shows how Descartes can't actually legitimately affirm the substantial existence of the ego, because we only experience our own thinking in time. We don't get behind temporal intuition, this inner sense, and arrive at anything substantial. And then Fichte, you know, and Kant's, he's right about that, I think. But then Fichte says, well, yeah, there's no substance there because the ego is not a thing. It's an activity, right? And so this is one of the ways that Fichte kind of finds he reads between the lines of Kant's letter and sees the underlying spirit, right? So, but then Fichte sort of falls into this abyss of thinking and can't find his way back to nature. So
before we end, I just want to share this quote real quick. but I think would be especially connected with what Angus was about to say. But so this is on page 165, and it's just, I think, a major morphological statement about the sort of development that we're tracing. And so he writes, Goethe was in quest of the idea, as were the Greeks, but he did not look for it as perceptible idea. He meant to find it in participating in the world processes through inner experience, where these can no longer be perceived. Goethe searched in the soul for the life of nature, whereas Fichte also searched in the soul itself, but he did not focus his search where nature lives in the soul, but immediately where the soul feels its own life kindled without regard to any other world processes and world entities with which this life might be connected. And so this part, I think, especially reminds me of what Steiner had described previously, with the sort of something had come to a kind of exhaustion with the picture thinking, and then sort of new process starts. He writes, with Fichte, a world conception arose that exhausted all its endeavor in the attempt to find an inner soul life that compared to the thought life of the Greeks, as did their thought life to the picture conception of the age before them. In Fichte, the thought becomes an experience of the ego as the picture had become thought with the Greek thinkers. With Fichte, world conception is ready to experience self-consciousness. With Plato and Aristotle, it had arrived at the point to think soul consciousness. So I think there's this like difference in direction almost from between the perception of ideas and then versus the what he describes as this participating in the world processes as an inner experience. So that distinction between experienced idea and perceived idea.
Can I add something? I know we're getting ready to wrap up, but I think that this is all very challenging because I'm remembering I read Christopher Bache. Some of you might know him. He wrote a journal on his LSD experiences, and he said in his journal he experienced in these LSD trips, which he took over like a 3-year period, Jung's archetypes, Plato's realm of forms. He was also, and the Akashic records. He said he went into these zones with all these different kinds of descriptions he had. But his direct experience was very different from Jung, from Plato, from the 19th century Blavatsky's, the anthroposophists, the different kinds of theological discourses we're familiar with. And I would just remind everybody that when they talk about world picture, they're not talking about movies. They're not talking about TVs. They're not talking about videos or the interplay, or they're not talking about MP3s or MP4s. That's all because of technology. Our sensory system has radically changed. So when we go back and we're looking at Steiner's version of the Greeks, Steiner's version of Kant, who was already in Steiner's past. And we're looking at Steiner 120 odd years after Steiner passed on. But we can study, because he's left this gigantic archive of the written word, something of the interior processes that he was going through as a spiritual researcher, because we all have, even though we've had these dramatic changes, a similar enough neurology. So I'm just thinking about this. When Goethe was talking about the plant, he went outside his garden and he imagined these growth processes from root to petal to flower. Now we can look at a tomato plant on a movie. We can take something that may have happened in a month and we can watch it in 2 minutes. So our imaginations are radically different than Goethe's. And I just want to share that because I think the subtle realms through our participation are changing very quickly right now. And I think that's why our world is in such peril. And I think I agree with you, Lorenzo, that first and that second and that third of purse is very important for us to study. Because I think without a third, an adequate enough third to contain all of these different firsts and seconds that we all have access to every day, we're going to crash and burn. Now, if we can find a third, which can contain these firsts and seconds, then that third becomes a new first. And I'm drawing from Steiner and a book, I think that is Steiner and American Philosophy. Someone that I think you know, Matt and Nashton, you know the author of this essay. I can't remember his name.
Robert McDermott.
Yeah, I love him. So he wrote, I think he edited this book.
It's a
which I like.
collected, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you're interested in the interplay between Peirce and Steiner, I think that's a very good source. But anyway, I'll pause and hopefully toss some of this into my volley, my volley debut. I've never done it before, so I may.
Thank you very much. It's very useful information for me. Thank you.
Angus, did you want to follow up? I know you were holding something.
Yeah, feels like going back a long way back in time to Alex's point about maths, the certainty of maths and algebra and that type of thing. And I wanted to do a not too rushed thought experiment. So we all imagine it's like we're in the pre Copernican worldview. We believe this is the center of the universe. And everything moves around us. We look over to the east, and our model says that the sun's going to go up there, and it's going to go down over there. And at night, I'm going to see the stars move in a certain in a certain way. There are different mechanisms to explain this, like the non-linear patterns, if I can describe it like that. And it's like of the movement of the planets and that type of thing. But basically what we're doing is we've got this world conception, and it's being confirmed by our experience. Then we take that the same person with the same eyes, and in that brain, in that mind, instead of the pre-Copernican world system, we have the Copernican. So we change our paradigm. And what happens when we change our paradigm? All exactly the same sense impressions that we have, sun rising, sun setting, movement of the stars and everything else, they all confirm our worldview. And then we go the third step and we go to the galactocentric, which is where you've got this lemniscatory, where actually the sun and the earth, they move through the galaxy like this. And okay, it's more difficult to see that, but basically that also predicts the sun's going to go up there and the sun's going to go down under there, and the stars are going to have the movement they do. And what we see in this very simplistic thought experiment is that we're seeing everything through our concepts, and mathematical concepts are the only reason they seem more real to us is because we've thoroughly penetrated them with our thinking. And that's one of the challenges of the future. Steiner says this really weird statement. So one day, psychology will be there will be the same level of certainty in psychology as there is in mathematics. And I think what he is getting at, I can only guess at it because I'm certainly not there, but there's this understanding that once you've got these clarity of concepts in your mind, that's these world riddles and these loads of different explanations that you need to explain complicated phenomena, they coalesce into one unity. And then the imagination or a picture can be used to represent that entire truth. But if you haven't worked through that thinking yourself, you haven't got the Copernican or the galacto, doesn't matter what evidence you see in front of your eyes, that sensory evidence is never going to convince you, because you've got to do the Fichtean inner work before you're going to recognize it, either in the outside world or in the pictures that you're seeing inside.
Yeah, thanks. That's a helpful reminder, Angus, like your comment a few weeks ago that we don't see with our eyes, we see with our concepts. I shared this story about Wittgenstein and a friend who I think was Elizabeth Anscombe, a student of his. which makes precisely your point about how mere sensory experience is never enough. All right, well, we're at the top of the hour. This was a lot of fun today. Unless anyone else is really chomping at the bit, I would love to introduce Chapter 7.
Please do.
Great.
I nominate you.
All right. All right. I just, shelling is close to my heart, so it'll be fun for me. All right. Well, as usual, I'll share a Zoom link. We'll do same time next Thursday. And I'll share the recording as well via email. And good to see more folks using Volley. We have a participant who can't join us live who's been posting some really, I think, insightful thoughts there. So hopefully we can keep that going as well. All right, everyone. See ya.
Good to see you guys. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Have a great
Bye.
week.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.